When the Canon R5C launched, it was one of the first truly hybrid video and stills cameras in the marketplace. Welcome to this Canon R5C video guide with me, Ollie Kenchington. Right, so it makes sense to start with page one of the camera's menu system, which is the camera setup page. And we're going to talk about everything to do with the exposure settings, and we'll base this around broadly the exposure triangle. So we're going to dive straight in with aperture or iris. As this is a video menu, we tend to use the video terminology iris rather than aperture, but it is, of course, exactly the same thing. So let's go straight into the menu, pressing the menu button on the back. A quick tip actually, the mode dial on the top of the camera, which your thumb falls on fairly neatly, can be used to go through the main pages of the system. So I can jump across the entire pages along the top there just by using the mode dial on the top. Once I'm where I want to go, so in this case the camera setup, I can then move my thumb down to the scroll wheel on the back, which enables me to go through sequentially if I like. I can just keep going down and it will move sequentially through the menu, going through each different sub-page of the main page that you've just selected. I can also use the top, what's preset to actually be your iris control, the top dial, which I can use to move only across the sub-pages. So I've got three different dials essentially that I can use with my forefinger and my thumbs to either go through the main pages, the sub-pages, using my index finger on the top dial there, or I can use my thumb on the wheel on the back to move through each individual item in those menus. Now that's exactly the same way that the C70 is set up as well. So if you have been shooting with the C70 or ever used that, you may well already be familiar with those dials and how they perform in the menus. Now I'm going to go right back to the beginning of the camera setup, and we're just going to talk about the iris mode. Now 99% of the time I'm going to leave the camera in manual mode because I want complete control over the exposure of the image. However, the automatic mode might be useful in certain circumstances where you want to maybe fix your, your shutter or your ISO, but you want the camera to be able to respond to subtle changes in your scene. So an auto iris mode will enable the camera to respond to the balance of exposure in the frame, and using its built-in center-weighted auto exposure, it will then counterbalance that using the iris. You can then control the iris increments, and this will obviously affect the automatic mode, but it will also affect the manual mode as well. You can either have half stops or third stops in the main iris increment menu. So as if I put that to half stops, come back to the main menu. Oh, hang on, I've left it in automatic. Let's go back to manual. Half stops, you can see down there, this is an f2.8 maximum lens. I can go half a stop, 3.5. There's my full stop to f4. 4.5, there's the next whole stop, half a stop, whole stop, and you can work your way through like that, or I tend to leave it on a third stop increments. So as I go from 2.8, I get the additional step of 3.2, 3.5, 4, 4.5, 5, there's my whole stop there. Now also beneath here, if we're going to fine increment and turn that on, I can actually do very fine adjustments. Now it doesn't actually look like anything's changing, and this is a bit of a pitfall with this mode, is it doesn't actually show those fine increments, so it looks like it's stuck at f5, but you will see the image getting darker or lighter as you adjust. So it's actually 22 clicks per stop or 11 clicks per half stop when you're in that fine increment mode, which gives you a fair amount, particularly if you couple this with a declicked lens, because you can have these RF lenses declicked by Canon. That does give you a fairly smooth, 22 gradations, if you like, per stop. So you can almost make an RF declicked lens in fine increment mode feel like a cinema lens. I'm going to turn that off. I'm going to leave the iris increment in third stop. I'm going to leave mine in manual. As I say, I like to have complete control over the image personally, and that's pretty much what I always leave it in. If I move across though, we can start to talk about shutter. Of course, if we think about our exposure triangle, we've got our aperture or our iris here. We're controlling that to let more or less light in. Of course, we're also affecting the depth of field. I don't want to patronize you. I'm assuming if you've come to a quick guide on shooting video, you're probably maybe a photographer, or certainly have shot video or taken stills and probably understand about depth of field and the exposure triangle. So I'm certainly not going to dive into that in this brief course here. But there is one thing that we do really need to dive into, which if you have come from a photography background will be almost meaningless to you, which is the shutter mode and particularly the angle mode. Now, within the shutter mode, there are several different modes. They all have different sort of distinct advantages or potentially disadvantages if you're in the wrong mode. The most common thing that you would normally expect to see would be the shutter mode when it's in speed. If I go back out to the main menu, you can actually see now that my shutter is now in speed increments, which is traditionally what you would probably associate with stills cameras. And if you're shooting video on predominantly stills cameras, you're probably very used to adjusting the shutter speed like this. I'm shooting at 25 frames per second, so I would have a shutter speed of a 50th of a second to maintain a normal amount of motion blur. But we are benefiting with the R5C of a true video menu system. That's one of the huge benefits of the R5C over the R5. It's the proper Cinema EOS menu system, and as such, I can go into angle mode. Now, what does that mean? First off, the reason it's measured as an angle, so if I flick across, you'll see it comes up as 180 degrees on my screen there. That is the default shutter angle, and that will give you a normal amount of motion blur in the same way that a 50th of a second in 25 frames per second will. So even though I've just moved into shutter angle mode and it's now showing me 180 degrees instead of 1/50, actually nothing's changed. The image isn't darker or lighter, the motion blur isn't changed, because 180 degrees means half the duration of your frame rate. So if I'm shooting at 25 frames per second, then every frame lasts for a 25th of a second. Half of a 25th of a second is a 50th of a second. Now 180 degrees is also half of a circle, so they directly correlate to each other. If you're at 180 degrees, you are essentially shooting normal motion blur. The key benefit of being in the angle mode is that if you leave it at 180 degrees, which I would most of the time, then as I change my frame rate, so for example, if I want to shoot some 50 frames per second B-roll, I don't have to remember to adjust my shutter speed to 100th of a second, because when I'm in shutter angle and 180 degrees, it will automatically maintain that half the duration for the correct motion blur. The terminology goes way back to when cameras were using mechanical shutters, and it was literally film going through the camera and a semicircular disc that was spinning, and when it was covering, it was essentially blocking out the light, and when it was exposed, then the light was exposing onto the film negative, and the speed at which that span was matched to the frame rate, and the fact it was half a circle meant that every, let's say, 25th of a second, half of that duration, so a 50th of a second, the film was being exposed, and the other half, the semicircle, had span round and was concealing and blocking the light. So that's where the terminology comes from. But suffice to say, what it means is it's an easy way for you to not have to adjust your shutter speed or remember to adjust it as you adjust your frame rate and maintain that normal amount of motion blur. Of course, you may want to deliberately introduce a bit more motion blur or have it less motion blur and have it a bit more strobic, depending on your creative intent for the image that you're shooting, and in which case I can click on 180 degrees. If I want a slower, more motion blur, essentially, I can move up towards 360. At 360, essentially, you are shooting at a 25th of a second if you're shooting at 25 frames per second. Or if I go below 180, then I'm now shooting at a much higher shutter speed, so I'm going to get increasingly more strobing and strobic looking effect. I'm going to leave it at 180 degrees for now, because that, as I say, is kind of your normal motion blur default setting. But that hopefully explains why there is a speed and an angle setting in the cinema mode, cinema menus, that you wouldn't have traditionally seen if you've been shooting with an R5, R5.6, or any of the mirrorless cameras which are photo menus. You wouldn't have seen this before. Now, there are some additional options. So there's a clear scan mode. The clear scan mode is very useful. If I select that and come out, you can see that my shutter is now allowing me to choose it based on frequency. So we have a hertz measurement here. It should be at exactly 50 hertz. If I want to shoot a 50th of a second and normal motion blur, as I just said, so this is the same setting, essentially nothing would have changed. But where this is really powerful is I can move very, very subtly off those main blocks. So 50 is my starting point. I can actually move just fractions away, both above and below that level. In real life, out in the wild, the most common situation I find is that I'm placing this at 60 or near 60, because I might be shooting something where there's a screen that's maybe fixed at NTSC refresh rate, might be a 60 hertz refresh screen, maybe a computer screen or something that happens to be in shot. And by setting the clear scan mode to 60 hertz, it's pretty close, not far off the normal amount of motion blur, but it's also managed to get rid of any kind of banding that I might be seeing on that screen, which is a very useful mode. I've used it when I've been filming events and projectors have been being used. Maybe they're projecting at 24 frames. So I can set this to 48 hertz to counteract that. So it's a very flexible and useful mode. Now, I don't use it unless I absolutely have to. So I'm going to go back into the menu, change it out of clear scan mode, and I'm going to show you now slow mode. In the slow mode, it actually goes back to using a shutter speed as the increment, as the measurement, and it essentially allows me to open up some additional options. So if I was at a shutter angle of 360 degrees, essentially the most amount of motion blur I would get would be equivalent of a 25th of a second if I'm shooting at 25 frames per second. By going into the slow shutter mode, I open up 3 additional slower and therefore more blurry modes. I have 1/12, 1/6, and 1/3. So if I'm in a third of a second shutter speed there, I am essentially lowering the frame rate or more into like a collecting light mode, if you like. And if I were to move the camera or something was moving on screen, there'd be a huge amount of blur with that. Now, I use this fairly often, actually, when I'm using the built-in time-lapse mode on the R5C. I often, particularly if it's people and I want to give a sense of kind of busyness, I often quite like to have sort of blurry shutter speed, and particularly if it's a fixed kind of, there's architecture and buildings and there's people moving, it gives a really nice kind of look of dynamic movement to time lapses. So by using the slow mode, I can actually achieve more dramatic motion blur than I would if I just left it in shutter angle and put it at 360 degrees, for example. That's the slow mode. And there's also an off mode that just basically fixes it at 360 degrees. You can see that my shutter speed now is actually grayed out. I can't select it, and it's fixed at a 25th of a second. I guess that's kind of useful if you just want to lock the camera for any particular reason. Maybe you're doing, I don't know, for example, you might be doing some frame interval work or something like that, and you just want it to be fixed. So that's the off mode. I'm going to go back to angle. We're next going to move on to quite an important topic with this camera because it's unique in Canon's lineup, which is the base ISO.